So as for the question, would I recommend the book? Absolutely. Over these last few months, I've read some books that I've rated quite highly, but this one might be up there with one of my favourites so far this year. Hi everyone, my name is Terry Westwell and today is Tuesday, which means it's time to discuss our Panic at the Book Club book of the week, which is Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. If you like romance, fantasy, or even thriller, basically anything fiction book related, then I suggest you head on over to the channel's intro video, where you can find out more information on how you can take part in this online book club. We'll list the next 4 books down below, along with the discussion dates. That way you can choose the genre that best suits you, and the best time frame to read it in. We also accept your bookish feedback in a wide manner of ways. Post your comment below a video, send in a voice note, or even send me a short video clip of you discussing the book. Alternatively, you can just send me a direct message. Orphaned as a baby, 19-year-old Signa has been raised by a string of guardians, each more interested in her wealth than her well-being, and each one has met an untimely end. Her remaining family are the elusive Hawthorns, an eccentric family living in Thorn Grove, which is an estate that's both glittering and gloomy. Its patriarch mourns his late wife, while his son grapples for control of the family's waning reputation, while the daughter suffers from a mysterious illness. But when their mother's restless spirit appears, claiming that she was poisoned, Signa realizes that the family who she relies on may be in grave danger, so she enlists the help of a surly stable boy to help her hunt down the killer. Signa's best chance at uncovering the murderer is an alliance with Death himself, a fascinating, dangerous shadow who's never been far from her side. Though he's made her life a living hell, Death shows Signa that their growing connection could be more powerful and more irresistible than she ever could have imagined. First is the spoiler-free section of the video, where we'll discuss any spoiler-free points before moving on to a clearly marked section of the video which will contain spoilers and more specifics about the book. The chapters in this book varied anywhere between, 6 and 18 pages, but also the text itself was quite big, so very reasonable, especially if you're someone who likes to read a chapter or two in bed or on your commute to work. I'm not usually a fan of more historical fiction. If it's set in a realistic, non-fantasy-esque world, then I generally prefer more contemporary fiction. That mixed with the fact that it was a fairly slow burn romance, which again isn't my absolute favourite, probably contributed to why it did take me a little bit to get into this book. However, once I did, I really did enjoy it. It was really easy to read and it wasn't overly complicated. It was still able to build suspense and had me guessing. Personally, I did find some points more surprising than others, but it was a really enjoyable read with a unique concept. At least it was very different from a lot of the other stuff that I've read. I thought the characters were great. I mean, perhaps we could have done with a little bit more character building on some of those more smaller characters, and I certainly wouldn't complain if we did get a little bit more romance. However, I think that's more personal taste than any real fault of the book. That being said, because of the sheer amount of characters that you are introduced to throughout the book, if there were any more detail and building, it could risk making it a little bit too overly complicated. I think there was maybe like one spicy scene later on in the book, with quite a few more PG romance focused scenes, but they were all within the last sort of 40% of the book, and it didn't dominate or take away from the main premise and storyline, which was this sort of paranormal whodunit. As usual, I knew pretty much nothing before picking this book up, and despite some of it really not being my usual go-to, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now moving on to that part of the video where I suggest if you haven't read this book yet, go do that first, because beyond this point there will definitely be spoilers. Okay, so there were definitely a few elements that I didn't feel were too surprising. I mean, I definitely suspected that Silas and Death were in fact the same person, but I did go back and forth quite a lot on that, mainly because their descriptions didn't kind of match up. However, obviously, I didn't click until the end that Death can actually manipulate what you can see. But for me, it mostly came down to those boots. I mean, there was just no other explanation or reason as to how they could have been kept so clean if he was in fact a stable boy. Not to mention that Silas often disappeared and turned up in a similar sort of manner as Death. But then for a while there, I did suspect that maybe Silas was in fact the secret child and he'd been allowed to grow up there. I was not expecting that to end up being Percy. I mean, Percy did act sketchy and a bit neggy when Signa was trying to help Blythe, so I did suspect that he may have had something to do with it, but honestly, my suspicions didn't go any further than that. In fact, when Percy got poisoned, for a moment there I thought he had died, and I remember annotating something in the book like he deserved better because I really liked him as a character, but boy was I wrong. I loved the ending and I loved Signa's character development. I liked how she's now kind of accepted into this new role, and I thought it was a great setup for the next book. I'm really interested into how her powers develop, and arguably more important, I am intrigued as to how Signa's and Death's relationship is going to work. I mean, did anyone say Shadow Daddy? Oh, absolutely not. Anyway, let's move on. Anyway, I can't imagine they'll go too long without seeing each other because Death follows Signa around like crazy, and I don't just mean the guy. The book could have been a lot darker, although it probably wasn't necessary. This way, it does mean that it's probably a lot more accessible to a wider audience, while still being quite tense and a really enjoyable read. I think it was really beautifully written and how it talked about death. I mean, it was really sad when Elijah had to say goodbye to his wife, while at the same time you could see the beauty in how Death himself saw the afterlife. Somehow, one of the saddest things has got to be just how lonely it must have been for Death, because when Death says that he likes animals because he likes how they can actually see him, I mean, that was so fucking adorable, yet really sad at the same time. So as for the question, would I recommend the book? Absolutely. Over these last few months, I've read some books that I've rated quite highly, but this one might be up there with one of my favourites so far this year. Will I be reading any more of Adalyn Grace? Despite not being very big on books that are set in the past, I think this one was set in like the mid 1800s. I would certainly be up for reading the next one, and hopefully I get around to it soon because I think the third book in the series comes out this August. Plus, I'm really looking forward to finding out a little bit more information on some of those smaller characters, like maybe Charlotte, or maybe now that Blythe is up and about on 2 feet. But let me know what you thought. Did you enjoy the book? Next week, we'll be discussing The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton, so don't forget to get your comments and thoughts in by Monday the 17th of June at the latest to be a part of the discussion. You can now do this on YouTube, TikTok or Instagram. The following week will be The X Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon, but don't forget if you do need a little bit longer to read a book, we do now list the next 4 books down below, along with the discussion dates. That way you can choose the genre that best suits you and the best time frame to read it in. Thank you all for joining, and if you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It is always appreciated, and I will see you next week. Bye.